your session a bit early.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Hello, everybody. And thanks for joining us today. Brian Westnedge from Sift here, joined by my colleague Chuck Swenberg and Dan Bennett from Castle Lake. Dan is the Bimi practitioner who we'll be hearing from, who has gone through both the DMarc and Bimi process. So looking forward to getting his insights. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chuck and let him kick it off.
And thanks everybody for joining today. We've set up this time to make it much more interactive. We do have a few slides that we'd like to work through because we want to give everybody a good background understanding of Bimi, the road to Bimi. And I think, one of the first questions that people often ask is, what is Bimi, right? So I've heard of it. I'm not quite sure what it is, but I hear it has something to do with logos. So with that, Brian, if you want to. So Bimi is an acronym that stands for Brand Indicators for Message Identification. And the way that I like to explain it is, it's really about the logo. It gives the opportunity now to put a trademarked logo inside of your emails and provides that logo and email to appear, as you see on the right-hand side, in your mobile client or in your desktop, a way to differentiate the presentation of your email versus not having that capability. And that's by using the contact circle that I think that we're all familiar with. Now, I want to give a shout out here because Bimi isn't something that's new. A lot of people have worked on this for a long time. Matt, who introduced Brian, has been part of that group. This is the Authenticators Working Group has done a lot of work to bring Bimi into reality. And in fact, even though today we're going to be talking about things related to VMCs, which is an acronym you'll learn in a little bit, Bimi has been around in use by Yahoo. And so Yahoo is an organization that pioneered this. So I think we have a lot of folks to thank in the marketplace to bringing together a solution that is now being expanded into the marketplace with further adoption. And so this is very, very exciting because Bimi means new things for marketers. It really allows you to improve your brand recognition, to have that consistent experience. And there's early research that's showing that it leads to higher marketing return on investment. And we have some research that we're going to present in a little bit. But I think that, one of the questions that I'm often asked is, why do people want to do Bimi? And so Dan, you've been invited as part of this panel. Do you have any special commentary on why Castle Lake decided to implement Bimi? And before you answer, I just want to make mention of something. Brian mentioned that Castle Lake adopted Bimi. They received their Bimi certificates, their VMC certificates, towards the end of July, 2 weeks after Google had announced general availability for the VMCs. And this is exciting because they were one of the first folks to actually go through the process. And we're lucky to have Dan here to share his experience in that process, to talk about that experience. So Dan, any commentary on why Castle Lake decided to implement Bimi?
There you go. Let's take myself off mute. That's better. So absolutely. And good afternoon to you all. So Dan Bennett, I'm the CTO for Castle Lake. Castle Lake is a private equity company that focuses on asset-backed investments with about $20 billion of assets under management. And a large part of our business is leasing of wide and narrow body aircraft. And I tell you that because that is in part why Bimi was interesting to us. So we had started down our DMarc journey back in 2019. getting to the DMarc reject level, where basically we're saying we don't want, if you receive an email from Castle Lake and it doesn't meet all of these requirements, then please reject it. And the reason that's important for us is not so much as a brand and marketing aspect, but much more because the cyber attackers out there know that when you're working with the airlines, we move multi-million-dollar invoices to and from the airlines, primarily in email. And if they can corrupt those invoices and change the payment instructions on them, there's every opportunity for them to take a multi-million-dollar lease payment on a couple of 777s or something like that and direct that to their own bank account. So DMarc was important to us to try and cut down on that and give our counterparties more confidence that emails coming from Castle Lake truly were. And so in that light, we felt that Bimi was just the natural next extension of that, that when a recipient airline or another counterparty we're working with saw that email coming in from Castle Lake with that logo on, it would help us give that confidence this was not a fake email. And, you know, without getting into huge detail about how this works under the covers, if you understand it and look at it, you can see it's very, very difficult for an attacker to fake this. They would really have to go through an awful lot of jump through a lot of hoops to get that logo to appear on a domain that you control that they didn't control. So to me, that was the big piece of this. It wasn't so much a branding and marketing piece. It was much more about giving confidence to our counterparties.
That's interesting. So what you're really saying is that the attraction for Bimi from a visual cue promoted some level of assurance in a way from a visual marker standpoint to allow the email to stand out.
Exactly.
So yeah, so I know that there's a lot of conversations that, you know, folks always have, marketers always have, about how emails are perceived. And I would imagine that users, if they're like us in our behavior, we look at who the email is from, we look at the subject line, and then we make a decision about what we want to do with that email. And so Bimi is really a de facto statement that allows somebody to know, to verify that mail is indeed from that entity because it has DMarc. And then you're providing them a visual cue. Do you think that visual cue is impactful? Have you received any feedback from your customers around the logo presentation?
I haven't yet, and I'm not surprised by that, really for two reasons. One, the audience that we would be, you know, that gets emails from us in general is not a particularly tech savvy audience. But two, and this is if there's a knock against Bimi, this is the knock against it. As you may or may not know, Microsoft don't support Bimi yet in Outlook. And we know that Outlook is the predominant email platform for the majority of our counterparties. We can see that in the headers, in the traffic coming from them. So I would expect that to increase over time, both for obviously the customers that or the counterparties that are using Gmail or Yahoo, you know, and we definitely see people using Gmail. But more importantly, when Microsoft do the right thing here and support the Bimi standard in Outlook, that would be when I would really expect that uptick.
Okay, that's great. Brian, any comments from you?
Yeah, I think we'll touch on this in a second, Chuck. Just some research that we had done to try to add on to the research that Marcel in particular published along with the Bimi working group a while back around how Bimi led to an increase in engagement at Yahoo recipients. But yeah, I think like Dan said, you know, it is fairly early days here. We don't have a lot of hard data. You know, Google has been GA for a couple months now. So we will get some more data as time goes on here. Happy to work with anybody, of course, that has some data that would like to get it published in the interest of furthering the ecosystem. I'm sure Matt would agree with that on behalf of the Bimi working group too. But I think, yeah, as we get, 6, 8, 12 months into people doing implementations of Bimi, that we'll get some more hard data. Hopefully, we will see Microsoft take steps, towards Bimi. I don't think they're close, to be quite honest, from what we've all heard. I know Comcast is looking at it, so I know Alex is on a session later. We can always ask them where they are in the looking process. But yeah, I think if you are a business to consumer mailer, or even if you're B2B with a lot of recipients who sit behind Google Workspace, Bimi can still be, of interest and real value.
Right. So I think the key thing for folks to note today is that on July 12th, Google announced general availability of Bimi for Gmail systems. And they're rolling out the process of support for different clients on the mobile side. We know that they're testing right now the iOS client because we have users who've come back and have been able to show and display logos, but not everybody who has iOS today would be seeing those. And today it's supported as well on the Gmail mobile client. So with the introduction of the VMC and with Yahoo also supporting Bimi, the understanding is that those who go through this process of support with the VMC will be granted support also for Bimi automatically within the Yahoo Mail systems. Fastmail is providing support for Bimi. And so that community of Bimi support from the receiving end is strong and it's growing. I think the benefits for marketers are, as Dan mentioned, trying to provide some level of consistency in the experience to allow for a better way of ascertaining the nature of that email, whether they can have a support and confidence in that mail, and preventing a level of abuse, because he said that they had implemented DMarc before, and that now they have a visual cue to show that they've implemented DMarc. One of the things that people often ask is, does Bimi improve email deliverability? And this is always a really interesting question because, first off, Bimi doesn't improve, just to make it clear, Bimi itself has no impact on email delivery, okay? It is the process of authentication and doing the right things with your email that have an impact on your deliverability. If you're sending legitimate mail and not authenticating it, that's going to have an impact. That's also going to have an impact on your domain reputation. If you do not have DMarc in place and you don't have an enforcement policy in place, marking what is your mail versus what is mail being sent on your behalf, you miss out on the opportunity to impact your domain reputation. So DMarc is a strong signal to mark the perimeter of what your mail is, what you take responsibility for as a sender, and then how you show that to the outside world. And the process of DMarc encourages you and requires you to align and authenticate your email, all outbound sources of email, to ensure that they're properly authenticated and so that they can be treated in the best way. And of course, that's completely separate from reputational elements, engagement elements, things that marketers also are keen to pay attention to. But the nuts and bolts of DMarc and Bimi doesn't impact it. DMarc can impact it, but it's really through the process. And so that's why it's always an interesting question that we always get, which is, hey, what level of expectation should I have? And the first answer is you shouldn't have a level of expectation. What you should have is an expectation that says, I have to do email correctly. And if I do those things correctly, it may have an impact. I think that's probably the most appropriate way to say it. Would you agree with that, Dan?
Yeah, Chuck, I wanted to sort of interject there from a recipient perspective. So obviously Castle Lake is the recipient of many, many marketing emails as well as emails from our counterparties. We are also the recipient of many, many phishing emails. And so the decision we've taken internally is, in the absence of a DMarc policy on an inbound email to ours, we will treat it as if the policy was reject. So if SPF is present and doesn't align, if DKIM is present and doesn't align, we will reject that email. And in doing that, we have greatly reduced the amount of fraudulent email traffic into us. We also have found, obviously, partners whose email isn't coming through, and we'll reach out and work with those partners when that happens. But if you're a marketing person trying to get to Castle Lake, if you haven't done this, your emails are not going to deliver to us. We will reject them. So I want to put it the other way around, so to speak, right? And so DMarc's very important to us on the recipient side.
Yeah, it's, you know, your comment there is interesting because for the first time, what Bimi does something that I think hasn't been done before. It really forces marketers to think about security. It's a new realm. You know, we read every day about ransomware, attacks on domains, how email systems are impacted. And so marketers now have to think, oh, okay, I want Bimi, but what does Bimi require? And, you know, the notion that it's built on some level of security, that being DMarc, is something that we're gonna shift and talk about now.
Yeah, I think if you want to leverage Bimi at either Yahoo, Fastmail, or Google, the foundational element is you need to be a DMarc enforcement, which means a DMarc policy of quarantine or reject on your subdomain that you might use for your marketing efforts, as well as the organizational domain for you know, that entity. So that means that you probably need to bring other folks in your organization into the conversation. If you want Bimi, it's going to be really straightforward to authenticate your marketing streams that you might be using with a service provider. I mean, that's part of the reason why you engage with service providers, as they handle, you know, things like bounces and list management and email authentication. So it's going to be fairly trivial for you to authenticate your marketing mail. What'll be a little harder to do is to authenticate the organizational domain that you use. So all of us, you know, think about, you know, our corporate email domain that we use for corporate email. You know, that domain typically sends a lot of other mail streams. They'll send your mail from Office 365 or Google Workspace. You know, you probably have Salesforce traffic coming out of that domain, HR systems, payroll, customer service systems, Slack, Jira, you know, Atlassian, all of these other cloud services we all use in our day-to-day line of work. Typically, those cloud systems are administered by people in the organization outside of marketing. So the nice thing about DMarc is it will give you visibility into all those mail streams. Once you have that visibility, you can authenticate all of the legitimate authorized mail. And then the value of DMarc is you block any unauthorized traffic that claims to be from your domain, but can't authenticate properly as you. But it really, if you as a marketer say, hey, I want Bimi, you know, it will need to be a cross-functional effort internally. You'll have to list folks in IT, messaging, and potentially some other groups as well. So it's not necessarily a trivial process to get the organizational domain DMarc compliant. Even though your marketing domains, that should be a fairly straightforward process. So I think of Bimi, you know, a good way to think of it is Bimi is a reward for doing DMarc. So DMarc does good things for the ecosystem. If you authenticate your mail as a domain owner, it tells a receiving mailbox, hey, it's not, obviously it is one component of delivery and deliverability, but it's not everything. It's one signal that the mail is wanted and legitimate if you authenticate it. If you don't authenticate your mail, then people like Google will display a little question mark avatar in their UI. So that's kind of the the stick, they're telling domain owners, hey, adopt authentication. The carrot is, hey, we're going to display your trademarked logo in our mail client if you do go through these hoops. So Dan has another stick where in his organization, he's rejecting mail. Even if you haven't implemented DMarc, if you're not DMarc compliant in terms of aligning your SPF domain and your DKIM domain with your firm domain, he's going to look at that mail more suspiciously. So DMarc is the foundational element of everything. You don't have to implement what's called a VMC, Verified Mark Certificate, at Yahoo or Fastmail. At Google, if you want to take advantage of Bimi, you do need to do that. And we'll talk about that on the next slide.
Yeah. Hey, I have a question for you, Dan. Given that DMarc is a fundamental part to, have the opportunity to implement Bimi, what was your experience like in implementing DMarc? Because I think for a lot of marketers, the way that they might implement DMarc today is, hey, I email off of a subdomain. We've got a policy. I work with a service provider. We're in reject on a subdomain. And then all of a sudden they say, hey, I want Bimi. And now they're learning, well, to have Bimi, you need to have a similar policy on your top level domain. What was that process like for you? And how would you share with those folks on this call, what to expect and how to have conversation? I know that's a lot there, but your experience would be quite helpful, I think, for everybody.
Yeah, so you're right. You've got to have it on the top level domain. It was probably 6 months end to end to get to P equals quarantine. We tried to implement it on our own and quickly discovered you get all of these emails coming in telling you about reports of undeliverability or misaligned stuff, and that you just drown in it. So that's when we went with on DMarc from Sift. So to be clear, I am a customer of Sift as well, and using that. And there are other products out there, but what they all do is they help you sift through all of those reports that are coming in and identify what systems are sending the email. And just as Brian was saying, there was the things we expected. So we knew Salesforce was sending email. Great. Okay. But then there's things like you didn't expect, like, oh, I guess that scanner down in the CEO's office is connected to an SMTP endpoint, and when he scans something for his home and he sends it home, that's an email that's coming out with the Castle Lake domain. So you basically, the process is you run this thing in report, you build out your priority list of things you need to deal with, and then go find the owners of those things and work with them to clean it up. And in doing it, I can guarantee you'll find some ugliness you had no idea existed in your organization. And actually, if you're in a large organization, your CISO will probably be a great partner in this conversation as you go around the company, because your CISO, he or she probably won't have any idea about all these systems that are reaching out and sending email as well. So I'd highly recommend you work with CISO on that. But from then on, it's just, I mean, it's sad grunt work, unfortunately, Chuck, but it's a case of just, okay, I've got a list of things I've found sending email. I've got to go through each one and figure out a solution for it and work with the owner of that solution to get through it. And like I say, for us, it took 6 months, and we found some vendors we were working with who they couldn't do it. They couldn't put DKIM on, for example. Okay, well, then we'll have to figure out another way to do it. So maybe send the email from your domain, not from our domain, those kind of things. But yeah, 6 months to get through, and none of it was particularly hard. It's just a lot of chasing people and explaining what you're trying to do, and typical sort of organizational project management.
Dan, that's a great point. I mean, I've never met an organization that had a email governance function that looked after email across the organization. Typically there's silos, right? If you're interested in digital marketing, you look after marketing traffic. If you're manage an Office 365 install, you're typically in IT and messaging. And then there's no one really looking after the Salesforces, the ServiceNows, the Marketos, et cetera. So I think DMarc kind of just by its nature brings this email governance function to bear, I suppose. So you will now see everybody mailing on behalf of your domain. It could be obviously legitimate authorized traffic. It could be shadow IT projects. Some intern decided, hey, I'm going to send a newsletter out of, MailChimp, and you'll see that. You'll see obviously the spoofing as well. So it's a nice, it gives you insight into all of your mail streams. And if you're in marketing, maybe you have a little less interest in some of those mail streams, or just not your core function, but you will eventually have to address and authenticate. Like Dan said, the chasing internally and saying, hey, sales operations, is Salesforce authorized to send for us? Or I also see another CRM system, what's the vendor of record there. And it actually, sometimes it forces companies to clean up their infrastructure. They might realize, hey, we have actually 5 different platforms we're using for marketing. Maybe we should consolidate that. Or, we have multiple platforms for, CRM and HR and everything else. So there's some ancillary benefits to going through this process. There was a great Q&A, that Dan just answered live, was like, what's the typical timeline for DMarc implementation? And people hate to hear this, but it does kind of depend on your particular email infrastructure, your own situation, how extensive is your use of third-party cloud services within your organization that send email. But Chuck and I have seen in our experience, it's possible to get to DMarc enforcement, in 4 to 8 weeks, depending on how complex your infrastructure is. And also making sure you have organizational alignment. Do you have the backing of executives to say, hey, DMarc is an approved project here. It has our backing. We're going to move, quickly on this. We're going to figure out what's authorized and what's not, and make that decision quickly. So yeah, it can take a few weeks. It can take a few months. It can take, some people, the project drags on, even longer. But, I think marketing does have a good seat at the table to say, hey, the cost of a VMC, by the way, we didn't really get into this, starts around $999 a year for the certificate. So in terms of other marketing efforts, it may be, a relatively minor spend for an interesting payoff. I would say if you implement Bimi these days soon, you're still in the early adopter phase. Those of us in our email, I think we would tend to notice logos in our inboxes, probably more than your average recipient, but we would think, hey, that's interesting. There's no default avatar anymore. There's no initial. It's actually this logo. It's Castle Lake. It's eBay. It's Pinterest. It's whomever. So I think for those of you on the phone, I think you would have a first mover advantage if you do adopt Bimi, which might be kind of interesting to your organization to get backing for the project.
Brian, what does the VMC do, and how is it tied to Bimi? And then what does the process look like to get a VMC if an organization wants to have Bimi? So we've established the prerequisite. They have to have DMarc. We've spent a fair amount of time talking about DMarc, but let's talk about the VMC and that process. And is that a concurrent process? Or what will the experience be like for a marketer or somebody on the IT side who's going through VMC processes?
So if you're not at DMarc enforcement yet, if your DMarc policy is none on your domains, or you have no DMarc record at all, the first step is to become DMarc compliant, a policy of quarantine or reject across all subdomains and top level domains. But that can be done concurrently with some of these other processes. So the biggest thing to keep in mind for a VMC is you are going to need a trademarked logo. So some companies might not have a trademark logo yet. So you can get that process going while you're working on the DMarc side of things. Also, and there's great guidance on the Bimi working group, by the way, on this, on some of the other requirements. So you'll need your logo in a particular format, an SVG, a particular type of SVG logo file. So that's a requirement. There is a certificate authority, it's called, who will issue the verified mark certificate. So the two certificate authorities you'll hear about are Entrust and DigiCert. So they do things, they issue other certificates, SSL certificates you might be familiar with, extended validation certificates that you see on websites and things. So it doesn't have to be kind of a linear process where you do the DMarc project and complete, and then you start Bimi. You can do all these things in parallel. You just won't see the benefits of Bimi until at least at Google, you will not see the benefits until you're issued that certificate from Entrust or DigiCert. And Chuck, I think there is an application process with these certificate authorities. So, you have your trademark logo, you fill out an application, Entrust and DigiCert will verify that you are a legitimate entity. You have the rights to this trademark logo you want to use. So that stops somebody from, like me, if I was a malicious actor, I couldn't just try to use, eBay's logo and send mail, with an eBay logo from a completely random domain that has no relationship to eBay. That's why these certificate authorities exist. They're validating that you're, a legitimate entity and the rights to logo. And I think you were just going to add something.
Yeah, I was just going to ask Dan, how long? So you said you had place.
Mhm.
The organization made a decision that it wanted Bimi. What was that process like for you to get a VMC? How long did that take? And was it an easy process? Was it a difficult process?
Yeah, so it probably took 6 months end to end, but honestly, most of that was because we were so early that not everyone had everything in place to make it happen. There was really no reason why it needed to take that. We were first through for a lot of, with Entrust, we were one of their first. Figuring out whether
just for clarification, you mentioned 6 months to get to DMarc compliance, but in terms of like when
6 months for the Bimi as well, because we started talking about it in January and got it in July. But it was, first of all, we had to figure out whether we had the logo trademarked. Our normal logo is actually a long text, the castle name with the castle above it, and that doesn't work very well in a aspect ratio of a square. But happily, we discovered that we actually had the trademark for just the castle part of our logo as well. So that saved us a bunch of time, because I thought we were going to have to do that whole trademarking step. Once we had that, we started off the process with Entrust. It really was not a lot of work. It's fill in a few forms and it's give people a few pieces of information. The weirdest bit about it was when someone turned up at our CFO's door to validate that he was our CFO and looked at his passport and stuff. And I'd kind of failed to explain because I didn't quite understand exactly how this was going to work. I told him he was going to do identity verification. So that gave him a bit of a shock, but luckily I report to him. So he hit me up on Teams and said, "What is this? And should I say yes?" Once he had it in place, it really, I like that cherry on the cake thing you said earlier about Bimi is to DMarc what the cherry is to the cake, because DMarc is the drudgery and the hard work, and that's where you really have to do stuff. From a technology perspective, Bimi is trivial. It really is trivial. It's just align a few people, talk to the right attorney in your company who knows about the trademarks you've got, find someone who's senior enough who can validate that the company is who it says it is. And the rest of it's just pay some money and get some certificates and change your DNS. So the Bimi bit is easy. And so to me, and we were asked at the beginning why we did this. I'm like, well, I've already done all the work at DMarc. This bit's easy. Let's just get this done and be one of the first movers.
Yeah. So in terms of, I'm conscious of time here because we've got about 11 minutes and we want to leave probably at least 5 minutes for questions. Brian, I know that there's some things that you wanted to share because marketers want to understand, what is the learning that we've had about Bimi today? Are there any things that you'd like to share about that?
Yeah, so the hard data that the Bimi working group has published is Yahoo's experience with Bimi, which was a 10% increase in engagement, which is great. And I'm sure hopefully Google will release some stats, in the future as well. We decided, kind of in the absence of other data, to commission our own study with folks, with consumers, and we showed them emails with logos and emails without logos. So it didn't mean that the brands had implemented Bimi at all. It was just logo display and email. What is that going to do? And generally speaking, these consumers, they remembered the brand and the logo better if they saw it in an email. If they saw a logo in a list view in their mail client, they were more likely to open that message if a logo was displayed. And then for retailers, where we were asking folks, hey, would this increase your purchase behavior? We did find that as well. So some interesting stats. Again, we'll get some hard data, I'm sure, from Gmail, over time. Actually, a good question for Dan is, have you even thought about, you mentioned your counterparties aren't necessarily tech savvy, so maybe they know the logo, maybe they didn't, but do you think you'll be tracking the effectiveness of Bimi in some way going forward? Do you think you'll ever do a survey, or at least anecdotally try to see what kind of impact that's had for you guys?
No immediate plans, Brian. I think potentially when more of my industry moves into this, that might be something that we would look at. Again, to me, this is all about trust and reducing the abuse of Castle Lake's good name to defraud our counterparties. And if I get any kind of uplift there, I'm very, very happy, because it's such a big problem in our industry right now. So to me, this is just part of a very, very multifaceted approach to that. Some of which includes not using email where we can. So to me, I look at it differently. Now, I think if you went and asked our corporate and comms people, they might have a different view on this. So I'm going to take this slide and go ask them after we're done.
Yeah,
if I could just interject here, Brian. So one of the things that I've been asked is, hey, I'm interested in Bimi. I'm thinking of getting a VMC, putting it on one of our email streams, but holding off until we understand the impact to do the others. And I always ask why. What is the issue there? Is it about cost? Is it about time? Is it about you want to understand the data? And I go back to what I shared on the first slide, which is Bimi is really about a visual cue. So intrinsically, as users, we all operate off of visual cues. It's human nature. So the research that you're sharing seems to me, while it's supportive, those aren't necessarily needed for justification, because we all know that visual cues matter. That's number one. Number two is that Dan's comment about trying to restore a level of comfort in their email presentation. What does it look like to the user if part of your email has visual cues and other parts of your email does not have visual cues? What is the experience? And we talked about consistency of brand experience in your touch points with your customers. So one of the things that it's really early to talk about best practices, but I'm going to throw one out there for everybody, which is if you're looking at doing Bimi, go all in. Don't try to do one at a time. And the reason is because when you go all in, you're making a statement that says you can recognize our email through these systems with a logo. And that becomes very powerful, because if you stretch Bimi a long ways out, what ends up happening is you've got the opportunity to say, this logo is how we identify our mail. And that becomes, in some sense, an anti-spoofing mechanism. So if we all projected to the future, a future world where everybody was using Bimi and there was an authenticated process to verify that your identity and that you own that mark and that you're using it in email, it would help solve a lot of security issues. And I want to tie that back to why marketers should care about security. And Bimi forces marketers to think about security, and it ties to that presentation.
Great. Thanks, Chuck. And we're getting a couple of good questions here. So I'm just might wrap up with some resources, and then we can do quick final wrap up here. But I think, certainly the authority on all things Bimi is the Bimi working group. So start there on any effort, any implementation you want to go down. We track who's adopted Bimi at a site called bimiradar.com. Just who is getting VMCs issued, who is ready for Bimi, who started DMarc, who has begun a DMarc project but hasn't gotten to enforcement. So there's some interesting stats there, and we have some other resources there on the screen. But maybe a question for Dan before we turn it over to the Q&A is do you have any sort of key takeaway or advice you would share with everyone on this forum who is interested in Bimi, maybe keeping in mind that, how does a marketer talk to somebody like yourself in technology about Bimi?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're talking to someone like me in your organization and you're trying to make the case for doing this, people like me care about security, and we care about the security inbound and outbound. And what I mean by that is the biggest cybersecurity risk most companies face these days is email and abusive email through phishing attacks, etc. And so, to me, when I first learned about DMarc and understood it, it was all about putting our own house in order. And that's the way I've always felt about these things: is how can we ask our counterparties to get their houses in order if our house isn't in order? And so I definitely agree with the point you were making, Chuck, that don't be half in on this. Either do it or don't do it, because I think you're sending very confusing messages to recipients if some of the emails show this and some don't. So to me, though, if you're talking to the technology people, it's about getting more control and to that point about governance that you made, Brian, about getting some control and governance about what your organization is doing, because every one of those emails that leaves your organization reflects on your brand in some way. And if one of those emails isn't actually from your organization, that's probably a very negative perception of the brand.
That's a great point. And back to the question earlier, somebody was asking, timelines to implement DMarc to get to DMarc compliance. I should have mentioned, your mileage may vary with Bimi as well, but Chuck and I have seen organizations, if you are at DMarc enforcement and you have a trademark logo, the actual process of getting a VMC can be a matter of a couple of weeks, by the way. It doesn't necessarily have to be a long drawn out process.
Yeah, I think that the couple of weeks is kind of like the quoted time, but it's generally able to be done much quicker. I know that our own experience internally is that it can be as short as a week. I think the longest time is related to the verification on the notary process, because that's a manual process step that has to be kind of organized, and you're dealing with people's schedules and availability and so forth. I think the servicing end that DigiCert and Entrust both have are very well supported to turn things around very quickly, and they're both, both of those organizations have a strong interest to do so at this stage. So I think that you could expect, if you are in DMarc enforcement, to get good turnaround.
Yeah. And one last question, Matt. I know we have 1 minute. Somebody had to ask a question in the Q&A about where does the logo actually display? So today on a webmail client, if you're looking at Yahoo or Gmail, you will see a logo once you open a message in the upper left-hand corner where there's typically an avatar. It's either blank or sometimes some initials. You'll see the logo there. On a mobile client, so Yahoo Mail for Android and iOS, and Gmail for Android and iOS, you will see the logo before you open the message in your lists of messages. So I haven't yet seen a matrix of every single, webmail client, mobile client, and how it's displayed, but that's been our experience thus far.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Fantastic presentation. Really enjoyed that. There were some great questions that came in. I was going to save them for the end, but you guys answered them as you went along, which was just fine. So I just want to thank you all for participating and joining us today. I may actually take some of these questions and save them for the next panel as well. So just, I guess, any final thoughts for the audience around implementing, not implementing? Where do you start? When should you start? I always like to ask that one. When should you start?
Well, I'll start out with that one, which is the first question is, does your organization have DMarc? Is it reporting? If the organization is not reporting, that doesn't mean that you're not reporting on your subdomain as a marketer. But if your organization is not reporting, you want to bring this to the attention of your IT organization. We have found are very effective at driving IT decisions because marketers have resources that IT organizations don't always have. And in the end, IT organizations are supporting their organization and marketing being a big part of that. So bring it to the attention of your IT. Number one, get reporting. And then I think the other thing too is that you want to use the resources that Brian mentioned. There's great resources on the Bimi group site. We are a vendor among other vendors that provide DMarc services. So I would encourage you to your IT department should look at many vendors to determine which vendor solutions make the most sense for them. And then from a VMC perspective, the other thing is that different vendors have different types of mechanisms about how they work with that process. So I think it's important to also understand. I would just encourage you to do your diligence and ask lots of questions. And I think that it's a small community. Email is a very small community. And you will always get good answers when you talk to folks who have an interest to propagate what I'll call good behavior and great opportunities. And Bimi is one of those great opportunities. As Dan said, it was like, I don't know if he used the words no brainer, but it was like, of course we're doing Bimi. It's such an easy decision. Why would we even wait?
Right, exactly that. And I would add to that, if you're in a larger organization, go seek out your CISO. Make friends with your CISO. They don't have many friends, so they'll welcome you with a warm embrace. And make sure they're aware of this and understand it, because I think you'll find a champion there in the CISO to help with that top level domain, and they've probably been looking for people to try and fight that good fight with them.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. We are going to get ready for our next panel now. So I just want to once again thank you, Dan, Brian, Chuck, for coming and sharing your expertise today, and hopefully inspiring the audience to start looking at DMarc, start looking at Bimi for their brands.
Of course, glad to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Just going to take a moment to transition our speakers over. Okay. We now have everyone. Perfect. So this session, we're going to do a bit of a Q&A.